When I'd finished high school and I was 18 years old, actually about 18 and a half, I joined the U.S. Army and I enlisted to become what's called a combat engineer. The designation for that was 12 Bravo, 12B. And combat engineers do infantry stuff, but they also handle demolition and minefields and obstacles and drive heavy equipment. And I thought, well, that's for me. And so I got sent to Fort Leonard Wood, which is where they train the engineers. And unlike many of the other types of MOSs, that's military occupational specialty, that you might have, where you go to basic training first and do that and get completely finished with that, and then go on to do your advanced training, your AIT, with the combat engineers, it was combined into this roughly 13-week period. They did have a kind of ceremony for us. It was pretty short. There was a bigger one at the end, but they had something to designate that we'd made it through the basic part of it. Although we were already doing a lot of engineer stuff in basic training. And I'll probably talk some other time about all the different things that were involved in basic training. What I want to talk about here is what happened when we finished up, which is they gave us a 3-day leave, which means that we got to go off post. And Fort Leonard Wood, they often call it Fort Lost in the Woods, because it's really in the middle of nowhere in Missouri. And as a matter of fact, when I first got there, I thought it was, a crazy place, because I came down from Wisconsin in the middle of February. It's pretty cold here in Wisconsin in February and snowy. And it was worse, way, way worse in Fort Leonard Wood. And again, I'll tell you the story about that later on. So by the time that we had finished up with the basic training part, it was, somewhere in April, and it had gotten pretty nice out. And what we all did in our company was we got a bus, and I think some of the older guys must have, figured this out. And we rode this bus. I think maybe there were 2 buses, because, about 120 guys. And we went to this town called Lebanon, Missouri. And there was a Holiday Inn, and we just rented out a whole bunch of hotel rooms. And there wasn't an awful lot to do in Lebanon, Missouri. There's not an awful lot there as far as I remember, although who knows, it may have changed by now. This is 30 years ago. And so, we're enjoying not having to wake up on time and do all the sort of stuff that you have to do during basic training and not having drill instructors yelling at you. And we wanted to have a good time. There were a few guys who actually hired prostitutes, but I wasn't, not only was I not into that, I wasn't going to use the little bit of money that I had for anything like that. But we all did want to drink. And, I was 18 years old. So obviously in most states, including my home state of Wisconsin, I couldn't legally purchase alcohol. But, we already had a track record of going into Milwaukee and finding liquor stores where people were, not going to card you and buying it. Or you'd find some older guy to buy you stuff. And at that point in time, I didn't really have a very good sense about what was worth buying and what was not worth buying. It was sort of in the experimental stage, you might say, of hard drinking. And so that led to a lot of, getting sick and buying really terrible tasting stuff and forcing it down somehow and mixing drinks that weren't really any good. But I knew I was probably going to want to do 2 things. One was eat food that I couldn't get on post and enjoy that. And then the other thing was, get some liquor. So I asked, some of the other guys, well, where do you go to get some liquor? And they said, well, there's this liquor shack down the road. You just got to walk down there. It's about half a mile, and you'll see it. It's right along the side of the road. And I was like, you got to be kidding me, a shack? And they're like, yeah, that's what's here. So I get dressed and start walking, and go in, and I think I was wearing civilian clothes because we had some along with us at the time. So I go into the place, and it literally is just a shack. Honest to God, you could have blown real hard and the walls probably would have come off. And there was like, there were shelves and there was like liquor lined up along it with price tags on it. And, there's an old, almost antique cash register. And then an old guy just kind of looking at me as I'm walking in. And he's like, what do you want to get? And I was like, I think I'll have some vodka. And so, he's, well, there you go. There's the vodkas. And I picked one of the cheapest ones. If I remember right, it was like Fleischmann's vodka. And he's like, anything else? And I was like, no, I'm this is enough for me. So I paid, and I think I paid like, $5 for it or something like that. And I was like, well, this is a really good deal. So I walk out, and I've got it in the proverbial brown paper bag that people have for liquor. And I'm walking along on the way, along the highway, essentially, state highway. And I get to the parking lot of the Holiday Inn, and there's another old guy, and he stops me. And I'm like, oh, crap. I bet I'm going to get in trouble for being underage and having this alcohol with me. And he looks at me, and this guy was really quite old. He was probably, in his 70s, looks like he had quite a hard life. And from the moment he started talking, I could tell that he was an immigrant, and he was from Germany. So he starts talking, and he's like, so are you a soldier? And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, well, what unit are you with? And I don't even remember exactly what unit we were at the time. And he starts asking me questions about that, and I'm getting kind of nervous because I'm like, maybe this guy is going to like call the cops on me or get in trouble. And then suddenly, he looks at me and he's like, do you have some liquor there? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, yeah, I like to drink sometimes. And so I was like, well, do you want to have some? He's like, sure, So I get the vodka out, and he takes a swig. And then he starts telling me a story. And so this is going to be a story within a story. I can't say whether it's completely true or not because I only have his say-so about it. I don't have any reason to think that he was actually lying about it because it's quite an incredible story, and it's a strange one to tell to people that you don't really know if it didn't have some at least grain of truth to it. So this guy was an immigrant, and he had come to the United States after the Second World War when he was a German soldier himself. And he was quite young. He was probably, about my age when he got essentially drafted, conscripted would be the better way to say it. And, they would just go into places and say, you're in the Army now. And it was, like 1943 when he got in. And that was a pretty bad time to be in because, this is after the glorious conquests of, taking over Norway or, Poland or fighting France and beating them. This was like a slog. By that time, belonging to the German army meant that you were like in, Western Europe and you were waiting for the Allies to invade, or you were in Italy and fighting the Allies there, or even worse, the Eastern Front with Russia, which is where the bulk of the German military was from 1941 onward, from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. And things had not been going well for the Germans by that time of the war. As a matter of fact, they were in strategic retreat in many places, and the Russians were overwhelming them with not just numbers, but just sheer production. And they were, the German war machine was slowly grinding to what would eventually be its demise. So this guy gets conscripted, goes through the brief training that he gets sent out to the Eastern Front, and within like a week or so, he's captured. He and his whole company, actually his whole battalion, captured, and they're all prisoners of war. Now, to be a prisoner of war in Russia was not like being a prisoner of war behind, say, Allied lines, or even, unless you were like in one of the nationalities that the Germans treated horribly, being in a German prisoner of war camp. The Russian prisoners of war camps, they really had nothing. And so deprivation was sort of the name of the game. And you also have all these Russians who themselves are just like 18-year-old kids as well, except for their officers. And they're ticked off at you for invading their country. So things look pretty grim for him. But from what he said, he noticed that there really wasn't much interest in guarding the German prisoners, because I guess they figured, well, you're out in the middle of nowhere, and they were literally out in the middle of nowhere, behind Russian lines, and where are you going to go if you escape? What's going to happen? You don't speak the language, you don't know the terrain. There's nowhere literally to go, and then of course there'd be Russian winter coming. Well, this guy, according to his story, he actually did decide to escape. And when he escaped, he found that it wasn't that difficult to get out. What was difficult was figuring out what to do next. And fortunately, he wasn't like way up in the north or anything. He was, fairly far south, so the weather wasn't too bad. And he and a buddy escaped. And they would, travel at night, and there were all sorts of interesting things that came about. I mean, one of these things, what do you do for food? Well, they figured out pretty quickly that they could like dig for potatoes and things like that. And so they, every once in a while they'd also steal food from places. That was a bit more dangerous. I mean, stealing the potatoes was stealing too, but you're out in a field and nobody's looking for you. And they would travel mostly by night, and then they would sleep. They would get into haystacks and hide inside there and sleep during the day, and then begin again at twilight. Another one of the big problems was your shoes wear out. And they tried all sorts of different remedies. The biggest thing was your soles. They had German boots, which were, according to him, not particularly well made. They're for the military. And, they walked along until their boots eventually fell apart, and then they would try to find whatever they can. But he did, according to him, quite a bit of walking with bare feet. And, they might cover 10 miles a day. And he walked for over an entire year, according to this guy. Again, I don't have any reason to doubt him. He seemed pretty earnest and pretty honest about this. He walked for a year, and it was continually going west because he knew that, that was the way back home. And by the time that he was actually getting closer and closer to the Russian lines and actually closer to Germany, it was pretty clear from what he could tell that the Russians had advanced quite a ways and the Germans were getting their butts kicked. And he was like, I don't want to be behind German lines or behind Russian lines when the war ends. So he made it into Germany, and then he could talk with German people, and he's like, looking where the Russians, what the hell happened here? Germany's been devastated. And they're like, well, the Americans and the British and the French are over that way. Just keep on going. And they gave him, new boots and a little bit of food and whatever he could have. And by now, his friend that he escaped with, or his fellow soldier, he was out of the picture. And he just kept going. And he found a way to get through the Russian lines and over to where the Germans were. And the Germans at that point, and I don't remember what he told me. He did actually tell me like what city it was near, but I don't remember. They were like, well, you really, the Americans are here. We got to surrender to them. Forget this Russian nonsense. We got to get over there. So everybody was moving west, and the German lines were just crumbling. So he did that, and he went and he found an American, the quickest he could, and put his hands up and, said, that he was surrendering. And at first they were like, who the hell is this guy? I mean, he still had a little bit of his uniform left, but he definitely was not in any unit or anything like that. And he had a hard time at first, until they got a translator, getting them to understand that he wanted to surrender to be with the Americans. And then everything was cool after that. He was like, I had 3 square meals a day. I didn't have to walk anymore. And then after the war ended, he found a way to get to the United States. And he wound up somehow in Lebanon, Missouri, and working for this hotel that we were staying in as a caretaker, and chatting up somebody who he recognized some sort of common experience with of being a soldier. And interestingly enough, almost his entire time as a soldier, he was either a prisoner of war or an escapee, right? But he probably had at least as much time in as I had, because he at least went through training. And so we chatted there, and then had a few more sips of vodka together, and then he was like, "Well, I got to get going. Very nice to talk with you and meet with you." And I went up to my room where I was staying with another guy. We were sharing the cost. And that was the end of it. I never saw him after that. And we went back to Fort Leonard Wood and resumed our AIT training, and then graduated. But I've always remembered that guy and that story. And, again, I don't know whether all of it's true or not, but I have no reason to think that it wasn't true. And it was nice to sort of share a moment with somebody who at that time would have been 50 years older than me, who saw something in common. So that's the whole story within a story of the German escapee from the POW camps that I met in Lebanon, Missouri.